Want a better smoke ring? Need a juicier steak? Today I'm running an experiment to figure out what's best, room temperature or leave it in the fridge. Check it out. Alright, so here's the plan. We're going to take 2 of these steaks and put them in the refrigerator. The other 2 we're going to let sit on the counter. Now I suspect you're not going to actually get an internal temp of room temperature by just letting it sit on the counter. So at the very end of our resting period, one of the counter steaks is going to go in the microwave until we actually achieve that room temperature internal temp. Now also at the end of our resting stage, one of the refrigerator steaks is going to go into the freezer and see if so we can see if there's any benefit of having an extra cold internal temp. Alright, so right out of the fridge, these steaks had an internal temp of about 41 degrees. After 30 minutes on the counter, we had about 53 degrees. 30 minutes after that, the internal temp was at about 58 degrees. At this point, about an hour in, I took one of my refrigerator steaks and put it into the freezer. I wanted to get that internal temp as cold as possible before I froze them. And I left the other 2 steaks out at room temperature for another 30 minutes. So an hour and a half in, my room temperature steaks had an internal temp of 62, not quite room temperature. My frozen steak, or my freezer steak, had an internal temp of about 35 degrees. It was at this point where I took one of my room temperature steaks and put it in the microwave until I got an actual internal temp of room temperature. It took about 30 seconds, and I was able to get to about 72 degrees internal. Alright, so I took them out and put them on the pit. I started off with the freezer steak all the way to the back because I figured that would finish last. I went ahead and used the meat thermometers that came with the Pit Boss just so I can be able to walk by and take a look and see where we're at. The next one on the grill there was the refrigerator steak, followed by the steak that sat out on the counter until the internal temp of about, I can't remember what it was, 60 degrees, and then followed up by the microwave steak. Once I had the steak situated, I went back to the controller and changed it from the smoke setting up to 225, my cooking temp. Alright, about 40 minutes later, we hit internal temps right around the 120 to 125 range. Since I knew I was going to put a reverse sear on it, this is exactly where I wanted to be. As expected, the steak that was in the microwave finished first. The steak that was sitting out in the counter still had a little bit more to go before we seared it up. So to finish the steaks off, I opened up the sear plate and placed the steak down for exactly 2 minutes. Then I flipped it over and seared the other side for exactly 2 minutes. Now this same process was followed for all 4 steaks. I got them to as close to an internal temp of about 120, 125 as I could, followed by 2 minutes of reverse sear on each side. So I was shooting for a final internal temp of about 135 to 140, somewhere in there. And I hit the nail on the head with this one, sitting at about 137 degrees. Now let's take a look. After resting for about 10 minutes, I cut the steak open to take a look at our first subject here, the microwave steak. So it's got a pretty decent smoke ring on it, good amount of juice coming out of the steak. There's a closer view for you. Let's cut a piece off and give it a try. Had a good amount of flex to it. Tore apart pretty easy. And tasted just as you'd expect a nice smoked steak to taste. Now I will say across all 4 steaks I didn't really note any difference in flavor. They all tasted just about the same. Alright, a couple minutes after this, steak number 2, which was the steak that was sitting out on the counter, was ready. Let's cut this one open here after 10 minutes of rest, of course, and take a look and see what we got. Alright, so I'm seeing a much thicker smoke ring on this one. About the same amount of juice, no real difference there. Very good looking piece of meat. Alright, we'll cut this one, cut a slice off this one as well and see if it tears apart any easier. Nice and tender there. Now I will say that this steak seemed a little more tender. It did tear apart easy, a little easier than the microwave steak did. Again, the taste was about the same. I didn't note any difference. Also about the same amount of juice that you see there on the cutting board. Here they are side by side. On your right is the microwave steak. On the left is the one sitting at room temperature. Much better smoke ring on steak number 2. Now surprisingly, steaks number 3 and 4 finished at roughly the same time. I followed the same process of internal temp of about 125 or so, with 2 minutes reverse sear on each side. However, my final internal temp on these was a little higher. I was closer to the 145 range. So this is steak number 3, the steak that was in the refrigerator. Good amount of smoke ring, good amount of juice on the table. I'd say a little more juice than was on the table for steaks 1 and 2. Not as tender. Again, I went a little high on my temp, so you can see it didn't flex as well. It was a little harder to tear apart. But interestingly enough, it did have a lot more juice. Alright, let's take a look at steak number 4. Now again, steak 4 sat in the freezer for the last 30 minutes of the experiment, or 30 minutes before putting it on the grill. Again, we got a good amount of smoke ring. I noted a lot more juice coming out of this steak than any of the other steaks. Alright, let's get a slice off here and check how tender the steak is. It pulled apart pretty easily, just like the steak that came out of the refrigerator did. Not a real big difference. Alright guys, so what did we learn today? Well, first off, you need to subscribe to this channel. I'm giving you what you need to cook good barbecue. Secondly, if you leave your meat out on the counter or decide to leave it in the refrigerator, you're not going to see a huge difference in smoke ring, juiciness, or tenderness. And lastly, if you didn't know, don't microwave your steak before you put it on the grill. Alright guys, if you got any questions or comments or suggestions on how I could do this experiment a little better, leave them down below in the comment section. Otherwise, don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.